The Making of a Luna. Previous episodes are available on the playlist. You can also visit our website for your favorite stories. A link is provided in the video description. Episode 7. Let us proceed to visit her. It is evident that a considerable amount of time has elapsed. It is imperative to formulate a justification or pretext to avoid the aforementioned obligation. It is imperative to recognize that this institution is our academy, and as such, it is essential to ensure the availability of engaging and fulfilling activities within its premises. Dusk, the wolf, urged him for the 100th time, but he already knew there was no viable reason. In this particular instance, the administration of the academy had been conducted with such efficacy that the operational processes were self-sufficient. Consequently, the necessity for direct oversight by the management was minimal, with the exception of the annual inspection. Attendance at the academy is not a viable option. I previously informed you that there is no justification for our presence there. He reiterated this explanation to his wolf, once again. Despite the absence of a rational basis, the decision to proceed remains valid. It is imperative to acknowledge the shared sentiment of wanting to see her, as it is not an isolated desire. Dusk reiterated his demand with a persistence that defied the typical demeanor typically exhibited by the alpha wolf. Despite the given circumstances, the following assertion was made: "No matter what you say, we cannot go." Theron rejected the notion with firmness, seeking to bring the discussion to a definitive conclusion. If the interaction could be characterized as a conversation, it would be more aptly described as the wolf issuing a threat. The method by which he accomplished this feat is a subject of interest, given that they shared the same body and thus could potentially inflict harm upon themselves. Despite the seemingly insurmountable challenge, the process was, in fact, rather straightforward. In the absence of our departure, I will persist in my lamentation until our inevitable departure. I will not permit you to work. With each instance of closing one's eyes, the subject is also reminded of her. Therefore, it is reasonable to inquire as to why you are not inclined to participate. Dusk inquired once more, this time in a low, threatening voice. Dusk acknowledges his affinity for Elara, characterized by a profound affection and admiration for her. The phenomenon of loving someone after only 2 encounters is a curious one. The ability to comprehend such sentiments is beyond my comprehension. However, I find myself perplexed by your inability to do so. I inquired as to whether you perceived her as a companion, and you indicated that you did not recognize her. While her human qualities are appreciated, there is a fascination with her lupin nature as well. He exhaled and massaged the area of his temples as he articulated his internal musings. I am unaware of the subject's lycanthropic inclinations. Indeed, I do not perceive a romantic connection between us, but her human side. It is challenging to articulate the nature of the relationship, but it can be described as being akin to a quasi-sibling relationship. Dusk articulated his sentiments in a state of perplexity. He endeavored to articulate his sentiments with precision, yet he himself remained uncertain as to the rationale behind his attraction to her human aspect, while maintaining an absence of attraction to her wolf form. Theron did not challenge Dusk's assertion. The wolf's words, though peculiar and unconventional to Theron, possessed a logic and coherence that was apparent to him. This sentiment was reciprocated by the subject, who perceived her as a potential partner, albeit with reservations regarding the feasibility of such a relationship. He expressed ambivalence regarding his sentiments, having reflected on them extensively over the past 2.5 months without arriving at a definitive conclusion. Additionally, he was uncertain about whom he could consult on this matter without arousing suspicion or appearing eccentric in the eyes of the council. Knock knock. Please enter. He issued a brief directive, his gaze once more fixed intently on the documents he had been attempting to decipher with no success. Your Majesty, I have been informed that the students entered the forest for their exercise. The assistant, who had just entered the office, informed Theron. Very well, I will supervise them. It is imperative to ensure that all individuals are adequately protected. Theron issued instructions without even glancing in the direction of the young man, who corroborated his directives and promptly departed. Throughout this period, the subject maintained his focus on the documents in his possession, or at least endeavored to do so. As dusk descended, the auditory phenomenon known as howling became audible within the subject's mind, in accordance with the subject's expectations. The wolf was a creature of formidable determination. Dusk's behavior in this instance can be characterized as unreasonable. He had already been informed by the assistant that Elara had gone into the forest for the exercise, which naturally would explain her absence from the academy. However, it appeared that the wolf found this state to be preferable. He was now attempting to persuade Theron to visit the forest and convene with Elara there. It is implausible that he could abruptly cease to be and simply disappear. Greetings, esteemed colleagues. I hastily departed from my place of employment and traversed the forest to convene with one of the students. Theron experienced a profound sense of desolation as he seated himself with his head resting on his desk, contemplating the profound implications of the events that had transpired. In his reflections, he deemed the situation to be of such magnitude that he referred to it as the scandal of the century. It is evident that Dusk's unrelenting howl persisted within the confines of his consciousness. Theron's misfortune was that the wolf, while not yet shifted and thus remaining in a spirit form, exhibited an inexhaustible level of energy. At the time, he was unaware that the attack would still occur, despite the protective measures he had implemented. A week later, her state of being was distressing, and the anticipation of ascertaining her survival was excruciating. Therefore, he engaged in an unprecedented act. He relocated her to the royal palace, ensuring proximity between them. The physician's directive to relocate the patient was met with astonishment by the medical professionals and members of the royal court, yet no one sought to challenge his authority. He remained by her side, awaiting her recovery, for a period of approximately 7 days. It was only through his proximity to her, observing her well-being, that he could find solace. Upon observing her awakening, he took the extraordinary step of acting on her behalf, providing her with personal care and attention, despite the potential for this action to generate further suspicion and draw the attention of the council. Elias, known for his loquacious nature, was present in the room at that time, and thus, he could potentially inform on him. However, he found himself unable to restrain his inclination to provide assistance. The subject was permitted a period of rest that day. However, Theron was still concerned about her, so he returned to her room just in time to see her walking and almost falling. He rapidly approached her and promptly enveloped her in his embrace, thereby preventing her from falling. Given his lycanthropic senses and velocity, it was feasible for him to arrive at her location in a timely manner and provide assistance. Reaching for her arm was sufficient, there was no necessity to maintain such close proximity to her body. It would have also constituted a gentlemanly gesture. However, at that particular moment, his body involuntarily moved in response to internal reflexes. Additionally, Dusk harbored a desire to embrace her, leading him to hold her against his chest with a firm grip. It is evident that if he were to concede, it would be indicative of his own volition and profound aspiration. The subject was engulfed in a state of euphoria, as if he were experiencing a sense of fulfillment that transcended mere physical affection. Despite the stoic demeanor he exhibited, his facial expressions revealed a profound internal emotional state. His thoughts were dominated by a single, dominant thought, the desire to engage in a romantic act with the woman, specifically the act of kissing her rosy, diminutive lips. He exercised great restraint, as he was not inclined to cause her alarm. It is imperative to consider how she would respond if he were to act on these impulses. It is possible that she would prefer to never see him again. The man's assistance was limited to escorting the woman to the restroom. Subsequently, he instructed the domestic servants to deliver dinner to her private quarters. He expressed a desire to be in close proximity to her. The following morning, dark circles enveloped her eyes during breakfast. Such an experience was undoubtedly challenging, particularly for a young girl. The act of taking a life for the first time, in addition to the physical exertion of fighting for one's own survival, is likely to have a significant impact on an individual. When these factors are compounded by the physical injuries sustained, it can lead to a profound sense of physical weakness and vulnerability. He had planned to conduct an interview with her after breakfast to ascertain further information regarding the attack, but he found her appearance to be too distressing to continue. Therefore, he engaged in the one activity with which he was familiar. He endeavored to elevate his mother's mood whenever she appeared despondent. He escorted her to his mother's garden. In addition, he sought a juvenile rabbit within the subterranean chamber of the burrow, subsequently delivering it to her. Upon observing her slight smile and the light in her eyes, he arrived at the conclusion that he had made the correct decision. They traversed the vicinity for a subsequent period, observing that her spirits exhibited a marked enhancement with each passing moment. Acknowledging his role in precipitating these events, he experienced profound satisfaction. He was also thrilled to see her in the place that evoked the most nostalgic memories from his childhood, one of the few places that held happy memories of him with his mother. However, an unanticipated occurrence transpired upon their arrival at the site where his mother's cherished floral specimens, the fairy's flowers, were in bloom. It was not his intention to ascertain which color her touch would display. Nevertheless, finding them agreeable, Elara herself inclined toward them to touch one of the roses. He was in the midst of elucidating the significance of the phenomenon when the hue of her heart was reflected on their previously translucent petals. The blue coloration of the roses was exclusive to the royal family. No other werewolves possessed the ability to alter the natural pigmentation of these flowers. The manifestation of the dark blue hue was contingent upon contact with the flowers by either him or his father, while the appearance of the light blue hue was exclusively triggered by contact with the flowers by his mother, the mate of the king. Consequently, during his formative years, the subject was the subject of frequent teasing on the part of his mother. She would often express her anticipation for the day when the woman who would transform the rose petals into a light blue hue would appear before him as well. As a reserved child, he maintained an emotional distance and did not respond to her verbal provocations. However, internally, he harbored a profound longing for the individual capable of transforming the roses into a hue that mirrored the shade of his mother's skin. Upon observing the young lady's posture as she inclined herself over the floral arrangement, and the red hue on her countenance as she inhaled the fragrance of the blue rose, his pulse rate experienced an increase. The sensation was nearly palpable, as if it would emanate from the chest region. For an extended period, he engaged in the search for his companion. He methodically examined each pack individually upon reaching adulthood. Despite his initial certainty of her whereabouts, he had gradually lost hope of ever locating her over the years. Upon encountering Elara at the airport on that particular day, he experienced a profound sense of empathy for her, one that he had never before felt for any other woman. Upon encountering her once more at the academy, he found himself utterly captivated by her allure. Upon observing her in a state of repose, covered in her own blood, he experienced a profound sense of loss, as if his heart was being crushed in unison with her. It was only when she revived once more that he was able to regain any semblance of emotional equilibrium. Dusk, the subject's wolf, exhibited a similar level of fascination. However, this phenomenon is exhibited exclusively from the perspective of the human aspect of her identity. The subject's inability to recognize the wolf species resulted in a lack of perceived emotional connection, despite the presence of other identifying characteristics. His mother had informed him that they would be able to recognize each other at first glance. It is posited that in that particular moment, the subjects would be thinking of the same word, and their wolves would be thinking of the same word. Mate. However, this particular word did not materialize in either of their minds, and they were both certain that it did not enter their thoughts. Therefore, the light blue color of the roses was an impossible color for her to appear. The question arises as to whether the reason for the subject's actions was due to the fact that the object of his affection was genuinely his partner, as had been stated by the subject's mother. It is evident that she successfully masked her true strength, effectively concealing it from his perception. Alternatively, the rose's blue hue could be indicative of her preeminent status, mirroring his own ranking, thereby signifying her role as a monarch among flowers. However, the subject's train of thought was momentarily disrupted when the female subject initiated a verbal interaction, inquiring about the significance of the color in question. He aspired to articulate the true significance of their connection, yet he was apprehensive that revealing it might dispel his aspirations should she declare that she was not indeed his partner. According to the source, the statement was limited to the assertion that it signifies a noble heart. His mother had been the epitome of benevolence, and Elara, based on her prior actions, exhibited a comparable degree of compassion. The subtle blush that suffused her cheeks as she comprehended the significance of the color was, he thought, profoundly appealing. However, his ability to fully appreciate her expression was hindered by his own internal turmoil. The tension that had been present between the two individuals was completely dispelled when he received a phone call informing him of Elias's imminent arrival. In the event that he was engaged in conversation with Elara and was interrupted, he would have been likely to become irritated had the interruption occurred in a conventional manner. However, in this particular instance, the outcome may have been for the best. He opened the door to his office and gestured for her to enter first, but she was immediately seized by a large male figure. Upon observing her in the grasp of another male individual, he refrained from forcibly extracting her from that position, in order to avoid inflicting harm upon her. Instead, he vocalized a low, menacing sound, which prompted the other individual to relinquish his hold on her, albeit at a proximity that left them in close proximity to each other. "Elias, I did not instruct you to come alone. However, it was not necessary for me to mention that I did not bring anyone with me." Theron's voice contained a palpable sense of indignation, despite his efforts to maintain composure. "I apologize, Your Highness." Despite initial reluctance, I proceeded with the endeavor of my own volition. "I am the beta version of the Moonlight Pack, Jackson Gray. It was not possible for me to maintain a state of relaxation on the Academy grounds, given the knowledge that my Alpha was injured. Thus, I proceeded with the endeavor." Jackson endeavored to articulate that he was already lowering his head, thereby exposing his neck in a gesture of submission. From the moment the door opened, the subject reported a sensation of oppression, which gradually intensified. "I was not addressing you, Beta." Theron's response was succinct. He experienced intense feelings of jealousy, and Dusk was also vocalizing his discontent internally. He initiated physical contact with her hand, which provoked a slight flinch from her, yet he proceeded to embrace her. It is imperative to consider the role of the beta in the pack dynamics, as well as the necessity of such familiarity in the context of the pack's hierarchy. "Your Highness, I apologize. It is evident that the methods employed in training the pack members have been inadequate. It is evident that I did not adequately reassure Jackson regarding my health status last night. The responsibility for this oversight lies with me. Please accept my sincerest apologies. This will not happen again." Elara promptly offered an apology. Upon observing the subject's frightened countenance, the subject immediately disengaged from his oppressive aura. It was not his intention to frighten her. "Very well. It is imperative to refrain from offering apologies. It is not your fault." He articulated these sentiments with a discernible gentleness in his tone. "Joshua, please escort the beta version to the designated waiting area. Should he wish to confer with his alpha, he will await the opportunity to do so. Subsequently, provide assistance on the return journey." He issued the directive while addressing Elara. However, his remarks were intended for his Gamma, who had also been present in his office. By taking this action, he ensured that they would engage in conversation, albeit briefly and exclusively in his Gamma's presence. Joshua acquiesced, promptly escorting the hesitant Jackson to a proximate chamber, thereby leaving the others to engage in discourse within the office. Following the conclusion of the meeting and the dissemination of pertinent information by Elara, she took her leave, exiting the office in the company of Oren, Theron's beta, to direct her towards the designated waiting area. Well. It should be noted that the subject's facial appearance underwent a substantial transformation, transitioning from a dark to a light complexion within a brief interval. It is reasonable to hypothesize that the Council would be less than pleased with the sight of you in such a state. The inquiry posed pertains to whether the Luna ceremony would be conducted or if direct progression would be made to the nuptial evening. Elias made a remark that was intended to be humorous, as he was the sole remaining individual in Theron's office at the time. He refrained from responding verbally, yet Theron's gaze was such that it appeared capable of inflicting death merely through its intensity. "Attention, please. The previous light look should be restored. The potential return of Elara is a matter of significant interest. It is not advisable to alarm the girl." Elias persisted in his jocularity, unaware that he was inadvertently disturbing the creature. "It appears that your workload is less than what is expected. Let us consider the potential additions we could make to your schedule," Theron articulated with a resonant voice. Wait. Vera has expressed her displeasure on multiple occasions regarding the inclusion of additional elements in my work. "I apologize, Your Highness." Elias promptly offered an apology, exhibiting a genuine sense of remorse. The time he had to spend with his partner was already limited, and the situation had already been exacerbated. Theron's actions were meticulously calculated to target the vulnerable areas of his opponent. However, setting humor aside, it is important to consider the following. It is imperative to ascertain whether Elara is indeed your consort. You have never demonstrated such a high level of concern for a woman in the past. Elias inquired, expressing a sense of exasperation. Theron was silent, uncertain how to respond to Elias. However, recognizing a need for guidance, he eventually spoke after a brief pause. "I am unaware. Dusk, the wolf, does not recognize her wolf nature, but both she and the wolf share a fondness for her human side. Is she a suitable companion?" Theron engaged in introspection as he administered a massage to his temples. It is evident that he was experiencing a state of profound mental distress, evidenced by his decision to solicit guidance from Elias. However, he was at a loss as to whom he could turn for assistance. The feasibility of this endeavor is a matter of intrigue. Both wolves would be capable of recognizing each other at first glance. Elias's countenance expressed a state of perplexity. "That was my own understanding as well." However, Dusk stated that he did not recognize her wolf. "Despite this, my mind is persistently occupied with reflections on Elara. Am I going crazy?" Theron conceded with a sense of defeat. "Wait a minute, you said wolf, not wolves. Do you recall the information I imparted to you in the conference room at the hospital?" Elias articulated the concept of enlightenment and, as if experiencing a moment of realization, gestured with his hand, raising 2 fingers to form the numerical value 2. The subject has been observed to exhibit behaviors indicative of having 2 wolves, rather than a single wolf. Which one did Dusk not recognize? Elias inquired as if to substantiate his suspicions. The specimen was determined to be a grey wolf, with slight traces of black fur. Theron then proceeded to convey Dusk's description. "That is her 4th-ranked wolf. It is also noteworthy to consider whether he had any interactions with a white, larger-bodied wolf." Elias inquired once more, his words conveying an increasing sense of optimism with each utterance. The subject in question denied the presence of any other wolves, stating that he only perceived the presence of a grey wolf. Theron's response, delivered in a contemplative manner, coincided with Dusk's assertion that no other entity was present within the confines of her wolf's chamber. The white wolf, being the primary entity in this case, maintains a position of concealment within the deepest layers of Elara's consciousness. It is imperative that Elara be compelled to bring forth Sable, thus enabling a subsequent examination. Elias reasoned. That is not a possibility. Theron firmly denied the allegations. He did not hesitate in his response. The rationale behind this choice is as follows. The pursuit of romantic partnerships is a common theme in the narrative, and the question of whether the protagonist desires to find a significant other is posed. Elias's countenance darkened as he grappled with the intricacies of Theron's cognitive processes. The man had always aspired to locate his partner. Why had he become so obstinate at this late point in time? I do, but I do not want to force Elara. It is possible that Dusk was not perceived by Sable because she maintains a high level of introspection, but Dusk is clearly evident in my own mind. It is reasonable to assume that Sable must have sensed his presence. If she was truly his partner, why did she continue to conceal her identity? Theron offered a concise explanation. We have the option of posing the question to her when she is in the open. Or will you persist in your state of anticipation? Elias endeavored to persuade him once more. He was taken aback by Theron's composure. His companion had diligently sought his partner, yet when presented with the prospect before him, he abstained from action. It is imperative to ascertain whether he experienced trepidation regarding the possibility of his aspirations being realized. This apprehension may have contributed to his hesitancy in taking action. He exhaled audibly when Theron remained silent, thereby offering a degree of ambiguity that would likely provoke further reflection on Theron's part. Regardless of whether she is or not your partner, it is imperative that you ascertain this information. Was this not the outcome that had been anticipated, even to the extent of persuading the council to divert its attention from another woman? Theron, if you wait longer, someone else might act faster than you. Elias provided one final rationale, though he did not specify the source of this information. Theron recognized that Elias was referring to the overly anxious beta specimen from the previous experiment. She endeavored to curtail the dialogue with Jackson to the greatest extent possible. Previously, His Highness had expressed displeasure at his presence at the palace. Typically, the palace was only accessible for official visits, indicating that the student's presence was likely to have caused displeasure. It is possible that he believed that Jackson's visit would encourage others to follow suit, thereby compromising the established security protocols. She made Jackson promise to desist from visiting her. Furthermore, her stay was expected to last approximately 1 week. In addition, she had been provided with a telephone, which would enable her to communicate with him at her discretion in the future. Consequently, there was no necessity for her to do so. She guided him to the palace's entrance, bid him farewell, and then attempted to depart for her chamber. Notwithstanding her status as a patient, she traversed a considerable distance on foot and was experiencing a notable degree of fatigue. However, her progression was abruptly halted by Jackson, who made an unanticipated stop. Alpha. I am genuinely pleased to hear that you are well. I am at a loss as to how I would have reacted if you had been in an unfortunate situation. He reiterated his actions and words from when he saw her enter the king's office. He embraced her with considerable force, even to the point of overlooking her injuries. The subject was taken aback by the familiarity she exhibited, yet given the closeness they had developed over the past few months, she did not intervene. Instead, she offered a gentle gesture, patting his back with her hands. This will be the final instance in which you venture forth alone. On a subsequent occasion, the entire pack will be at your disposal. We will never again permit such an occurrence." He confirmed his affirmation in a hushed tone, speaking in close proximity to her ear. She acknowledged the gesture with a subtle inclination of her head and a faint smile, recognizing the profound care her pack demonstrated towards her. This was an unfamiliar sentiment for her, but it was not inherently negative. Jackson disengaged from his embrace and proceeded toward the door, definitively departing from the scene. The subject turned around once more, intending to ascend the stairs leading to her room, when she encountered Theron's eyes at the top of the stairs. She ascended the stairs with measured pace, her demeanor reflecting a modicum of shyness in the presence of the man, her thoughts occupied with the question of whether he had observed the embrace between her and Jackson. There were no regulations that explicitly prohibited romantic relationships or close physical proximity between watchers. However, it is conceivable that he misinterpreted the situation, and this misinterpretation caused him discomfort, particularly given the setting, the royal palace. It should be noted that she experienced a sense of culpability for embracing Jackson in his presence, yet she was overwhelmed by his formidable aura to the extent that she was unable to recognize this sentiment. "Has your beta left?" he inquired with a gentle voice, yet his countenance remained unresponsive, devoid of any discernible emotion. "Affirmative, Your Highness, he has. I would like to express my sincere regret once more. It has been determined that his visits should be terminated. In any case, my stay will be limited to 1 week, and thus I will not be receiving any further visitors." In an attempt to provide reassurance, she responded, indicating that neither she nor her pack would pose any further disturbance. However, as she elevated her head and gazed into his eyes, she remained motionless. The distinctive ocean blue irises that had once caused her discomfort with a mere glance were now undergoing a gradual transformation. Over time, these eyes lost their characteristic blue hue, becoming increasingly dark. It appeared as though he was attempting to regulate his lupin instincts. Recognizing her startled reaction and ascertaining the cause, he swiftly averted his gaze, ensuring that she could no longer see his face. He then articulated a few additional words before departing in a brisk manner. She comprehended the response of His Highness, discerning the underlying motivations that guided his actions, though he did not explicitly articulate them. Nevertheless, she found herself taken aback by the incident. The subject's demeanor has undergone a significant shift, transitioning from a state of placidity to one of aggression. This transformation is particularly pronounced when considering the contrast with his behavior earlier in the day, which exhibited a markedly different disposition. Given the fact that he had nearly lost control of his wolf at that very moment, she felt as though her ability to understand him was progressively diminishing with each passing instant. The subject had become accustomed to the subject's behavior from the previous evening, and thus, in the morning, she believed that it was his usual manner of speech. Although he did continue to address her in a gentle manner, he directed a menacing growl toward Jackson. It is possible that he exhibited a greater degree of leniency towards girls than towards boys. These were the thoughts that occupied her mind as she proceeded to open her smartphone. She scarcely initiated the phone's auditory output when the telephone commenced its ringing. Upon opening her eyes, she became aware of the numerous missed phone calls, amounting to approximately a dozen, that had accumulated in the period immediately preceding the moment she opened her eyes. Her response was prompt and reflexive. She identified her brother Lucien without hesitation. It is reasonable to conclude that he was not concerned about her well-being, as she had informed him that she would be participating in an exercise program for a period of 2 weeks and would not be carrying her mobile phone with her during that time. The subject was in the forest for a period of 7 days, after which she was unconscious for an additional 7 days. Given this timeline, it is reasonable to conclude that her brother's decision to not contact her during this time should not have caused any concern. Sister. After a considerable period of time, you finally responded to your telephone. I have been attempting to contact you since morning. Lucien articulated his relief at her eventual response. Affirmative. The phone's lack of battery life is regrettable. I only just noticed and plugged it in. The speaker articulated her perspective in a straightforward manner. Given that the attempt to establish communication occurred only this morning, it is reasonable to conclude that there was no reason for him to ascertain the reason for her non-response until now. Her actions were driven by the desire to alleviate his concerns. What is the matter? She inquired of him, motivated by a combination of curiosity and concern, which was exacerbated by the sense of urgency she perceived in his tone. I am aware that the events that transpired were of an inexcusable nature. The actions perpetrated by Elara and her mother, which included the deliberate usurpation of one's legitimate partner, constitute transgressions that cannot be overlooked. This rationale underlies the decision to refrain from addressing these issues during our previous interactions. I did not wish to exacerbate your suffering. Lucien endeavored to rationalize the rationale behind his introduction of these seemingly illogical issues. The aforementioned subjects had not been discussed between the two parties since the incident occurred. However, it was believed that disclosure was necessary for her to provide assistance. Lucien, I implore you to refrain from attempting to motivate your statements. Instead, I request that you articulate the precise nature of the issue at hand. She interrupted him, releasing a sigh that emanated from her chest. The subject reported experiencing fatigue, both mental and physical, following the attack. Recurrent memories of the dismemberment and subsequent killing of the hunters persisted in her mind during periods of solitude. At this juncture, she experienced an overwhelming desire to sleep. He began to articulate an utterance, but then paused and exhaled, attempting to formulate a suitable expression to convey his thoughts to her. However, he did not utter another word as the telephone was abruptly seized from his grasp, and a distinct voice became audible through the device. Elara, following your departure. Elara was designated as the Luna of our pack. Given her advanced state of pregnancy, it was evident to all present that the ceremony was intended to mark her as Devon's Luna. Consequently, Devon compelled Karen to acknowledge her as his Luna, a decision that was widely anticipated. Conversely, the absence of such a provision would likely impede the transfer of leadership. It was also made evident that the individual in question will not be considered as a suitable partner. The crux of the issue pertains to the discord that has arisen despite the execution of the Luna ceremony by the male subject. The relationship has deteriorated to such an extent that there have been numerous physical altercations, with the man even resorting to physical violence. At present, the patient is hospitalized, and there is a significant possibility that she will miscarry. Her father, in a detached manner, took the telephone from Lucien. Notwithstanding the verbal affronts she had just suffered at his hands, he offered no apology. The subject, did not express regret or reflection regarding their actions, nor did they demonstrate repentance for the harm they caused. The subject was unable to formulate a response to the recent auditory information. She was moved to tears by the suffering of her sister and felt a profound sense of disquiet when innocent children were subjected to harm caused by the irresponsible actions of adults. Nevertheless, they did not attempt to establish communication with her during this period to ascertain her well-being, despite the fact that she was the individual who suffered the gravest consequences of the events that transpired and their subsequent betrayal. Moreover, they contacted her by telephone to inform her of Elara. The subject was a person who was suffering as a consequence of her own actions and who most probably wanted her to take action. It is important to note that approximately 1 week ago, the patient was at risk of dying. However, it is equally important to note that no members of her family would have been concerned if she had died. It was a widely held belief that werewolves from the same family would experience a certain degree of emotional response if they perceived that a loved one had been injured, particularly if the injury resulted in the individual's demise. The subjects should have been able to empathize with the subject's experience of being attacked and the subsequent feeling of utter powerlessness as she felt her life being drained from her body. This would have been particularly poignant given that she was considered a loved one by the subjects. She listened to her father as these thoughts inundated her mind, offering no interruption. She awaited a verbal indication of his concern for her well-being. As he expounded, her eyes began to well up with tears. He did not utter a greeting, and as she pondered this, a diminutive solitary tear descended onto her poker-faced countenance, seemingly devoid of emotion. He neglected to inquire about her well-being and the means by which she was managing. A lacrimal drop descended from the other eye, traversing the entire length of her cheek and culminating at her jaw. "I am aware of your intelligence and your profound affection for your sister, and I am certain that you would undertake any task for her. The harmony of a pack is contingent upon the harmonious relationship between the alpha and the alpha female. The couple is currently in a state of cohabitation and expecting a child. However, due to the lack of formal rejection of Karen, a connection between the two individuals persists, thereby hindering the complete acceptance of Elara by Karen, as would have been customary following the ceremonial ritual." Her father exhaled, and, as he elucidated the premises of what he was about to request of her, finally broached the matter he sought from her. "It is understood that one is not at liberty to depart from the Academy premises without authorization and to attend the gathering of Alphas and Betas at the Royal Palace on December 20th. It should be noted that a period of leave will be granted for a duration corresponding to the length of time for which the Academy is closed. This leave will allow for a period of absence from the Academy for a duration of several days. It is recommended that permission be requested from the teachers to visit the Royal Palace. It has been decided that your mother, Karen, Elara, and I will be residing in one of the buildings adjacent to the palace. It is imperative that you meet with Karen to settle your differences once and for all. It is imperative to formally reject him this time to restore equilibrium." At that point, he finally spoke, his demeanor marked by a palpable sense of composure. This daughter of his had always been attentive to his words. The previous instance had been a mere incident, as she had been disconcerted. However, it is reasonable to assume that, by that point in time, she had already adapted to the circumstances. At this juncture, the subject's face was already visibly moist, to the point that she was unable to see clearly. Initially, Elara's father asserted that her injuries were so severe that she was at risk of losing the child. Ultimately, he stated that she would be in attendance at the ball, which was scheduled to take place in 4 days. In the event that she sustained such severe injuries, it is perplexing why she would still travel. The subject's attempts to manipulate the subject's sentiments toward her sister persisted, and concomitantly, they endeavored to inculcate in her the awareness of the imperative to act in accordance with the prevailing ethical standards. She closed her eyes as she attempted to halt the flow of tears. At the time, she was so shocked that she attended the Luna ceremony. She only wanted to get away from her pack territory, and she had omitted to formally reject Karen. For the duration of the relationship, the subject had not entertained the notion that the other was her partner. Consequently, she had not formally rejected him. Very well. During the course of the telephone conversation, the subject articulated a single word to her father, a word that was spoken in a cracked voice. "Good, that is my daughter. Study diligently and endeavor to meet my expectations." In response, he expressed satisfaction with her response. He failed to perceive the peculiar quality of her voice. While this was not an uncommon occurrence, he had not been particularly attentive to her condition. In the subsequent moment, only the sound of the phone call concluding was audible. He had obtained the object of his desire from her, therefore, it would be superfluous to continue the conversation. It is important to note that her status as his daughter was only acknowledged insofar as she acquiesced to his desires. She allowed the phone to fall from her hand without checking her other missed calls or messages. The patient exhibited a marked reluctance to engage in sleep. Despite her unsteady movements and impaired vision, she rose to her feet and once again vocalized internally, "Sable. Naira." However, this call remained unanswered. Subsequently, she made a second attempt to contact them, but her efforts were once again met with silence. It is also possible that she was left behind. She proceeded with caution, exiting her room and traversing the length of the hallway until she arrived at the indoor garden. His Royal Highness had stated that she was at liberty to return at any time, however, she had not anticipated the necessity of a place of comfort so promptly. In fact, she resolved in her mind that she would not return to this place. It must be noted that the room in question was a private chamber belonging to the mother of the aforementioned individual. It is perplexing that a werewolf of such low rank could simply enter the premises with such ease. She proceeded to open the door and enter the garden, navigating towards its central area with measured steps. With a delicate and measured touch, she graced the transparent petals of the rose, a flower of such exquisite beauty that its splendor nearly overwhelmed her. Subsequently, the petals underwent a color change, acquiring a blue hue with white edges, reminiscent of their initial state. Ha ha ha! She smiled to herself, tears still flowing down her cheeks. She considered the notion of a noble heart to be a fallacy. This phenomenon can be likened to a rag that is utilized for the convenience of all parties involved, yet once its utility is no longer required, it is often disregarded. This individual is regarded as a convenient person. Experiencing a sense of defeat, she seated herself on the floor, ceasing to weep. Nevertheless, she continued to appreciate the roses before her. Elara. At the nadir of her emotional state, a voice from behind her called out, providing a much-needed source of solace. However, she refrained from turning around. This individual had only observed her in her most debilitated state, wounded, and subsequently enervated. Presently, she was also weeping. She felt embarrassed by her current state of disarray. She swiftly wiped away her tears with her hands as she sensed his approach, but her red eyes remained unresponsive. She was vigorously wiping when an outstretched hand abruptly halted her from wiping once more. "Are you well? Do you have any injuries?" he inquired, his tone conveying concern and agitation, attempting to ascertain the underlying cause of her apparent disquiet. It is possible that her trepidation was exacerbated by the somber expression in his eyes. What course of action should he pursue to alleviate her trepidation? In the event that she desired to depart from the palace due to his presence, what course of action would he recommend? Unaware of the myriad of misgivings harbored within this individual's mind, Elara cast a glance in his direction, experiencing a sense of embarrassment. He articulated the sentiments she sought in her father's words. Her observation of his eyes revealed the care she wished she had received from her family. In response to his tender utterances, she remained silent, her admiration evident only in her continued contemplation of his concerned countenance. The subject's eyes, characterized by their aesthetic appeal, exhibited a furrowed expression in response to the aforementioned individual. He swiftly discerned her emotional state through physical observation, and, unbeknownst to her, she found herself embracing him, weeping in a manner she had never previously experienced. The patient had been afflicted by nightmares during her sleep the previous night. However, following such a restful sleep, she experienced a sense of rejuvenation. Indeed, since her departure from the confines of her pack territory, this has been the most restful sleep she has experienced. The subject reported experiencing such a high degree of comfort that she did not open her eyes. She indicated that she was attempting only to cuddle more in the warm bed, which was fragrant with fresh flowers and a familiar, comforting musk scent with tinges of lavender. The subject found the situation peculiar. There were no fresh flowers in the guest room, yet the scent of fresh flowers and musk was evident. In an attempt to regain composure, she embraced the pillow more firmly, but then she felt a gentle, moist touch on her forehead. The sensation was reminiscent of a feather-like kiss. This unexpected stimulus caused her to abruptly open her eyes and direct her gaze toward the source of the touch, only to find herself gazing directly into the pair of deep blue eyes of the monarch. However, this was not the most humiliating incident. The most disconcerting aspect of the incident was the fact that, when she moved abruptly, their eyes were locked on each other, and their lips were also in perfect alignment. The subject was so taken aback that, despite the continued contact between their lips, she did not disengage. At this moment, she experienced difficulty breathing and felt a rapid, impending cardiac event. This was not solely due to the regrettable incident, which was arguably the lesser of two evils. Of greater significance was the fact that His Highness had not exhibited a comparable level of mobility. Following a period of sustained immobility, the subject exhibited a sudden movement, indicating a return to a state of awareness. Upon observing her environment, she ascertained that she was situated within the confines of the indoor garden belonging to the aforementioned individual of high standing. It was only after relinquishing her hold and retreating that she became aware of the fact that she had been nestled in his embrace and had been slumbering. The pillow, which had initially provided comfort to her, was now being utilized to support his waist and chest. Her face exhibited a reddish hue. It is imperative to ascertain the rationale behind her assumption that she would be in her bed when there is compelling evidence that she was in the garden. Please accept my sincerest apologies, Your Highness. I regret to inform you that I have made contact with you. She attempted to offer an apology, but was rendered mute when she realized that she had also embraced him and inadvertently made contact with his lips. The subject's refusal to apologize is unequivocal. He maintained composure and gazed directly at her as he firmly confirmed her suspicions. She maintained a downward gaze, her speech characterized by a stuttering cadence, while refraining from making direct eye contact. However, the gravity of his words instigated an instinctive glance in his direction, and upon observing the intensity in his eyes, she experienced a sudden paralysis in her body and facial muscles. In light of his utterances, what could she possibly articulate in response? For a period of time, she maintained a state of silence, experiencing a sensation of being overwhelmed by his gaze, as if his eyes had become a means of communication that she could not resist. The subject reported that it felt impossible to break eye contact. He did not utter a word, yet his gaze appeared to issue a command, urging her to maintain eye contact. It was not my intention to make physical contact with Your Highness. She offered a subsequent apology, albeit with evident difficulty. It is possible that she had misinterpreted the intended meaning of his words. It is evident that her cognitive abilities were impaired at that particular moment. It is evident that the aforementioned action did not constitute a form of physical contact. He interrupted her, refusing to accept the possibility that the incident was merely an accident, despite the evident nature of the event. It was a kiss. Theron persisted with a voice that was both hoarse and determined. She exhibited a marked dilation of the eyes and a concomitant erythema of the face, which was further exacerbated by the realization of her actions. The individual in question had the audacity to utter the word that she had been reticent to mention. The term touch was employed, signifying merely a minimal contact between their epidermis. The individual in question demonstrated a remarkable ability to refrain from experiencing any sense of embarrassment in this context. That was not I. She endeavored to refute, but was met with considerable difficulty. At this juncture, she was barely able to select her words with any degree of precision. It is difficult to fathom how such an act could be committed against an individual with whom minimal personal history existed, particularly when the perpetrator is a figure of authority such as the king. "What is a kiss, Elara?" he inquired, his voice having seemingly transitioned to a more pronounced tone. This behavior could be interpreted as an implied statement. However, she found herself unable to respond. It is unclear how she could provide an oral explanation of the definition of a kiss, as doing so would serve only to validate his statements. "What is a kiss, Elara?" He reiterated his inquiry, maintaining the same intonation. It was impossible for her to blink or think because he never left her gaze. The process of cognitive deconditioning involves the eradication of all negative thought patterns, thereby facilitating the dissolution of depressive symptoms. "What is a hug, Elara?" He persisted in his interrogation, failing to grant her an opportunity to compose herself. The subject was unable to respond to the initial inquiry. However, the individual in question reiterated the occurrence of the embrace. At this juncture, her respiratory function ceased entirely. Perceiving that his continued presence was no longer sustainable for her heart, she engaged in the sole action that appeared rational. She rose to her feet and hastily departed, disregarding her status as a patient and the fact that he was the king, thereby displaying a lack of courtesy in her actions. She continued running until she reached her room and closed the door. She continued to exert pressure with her back against the door, which was thereby obstructed, and she breathed with considerable effort. It appeared that she was attempting to compensate for the air she was unable to breathe in his presence. As her legs lost their strength and she was unable to support her body, she slid down until she was seated on the floor. She was powerless to alter the course of events that had transpired. It was she who initiated the embrace, thus leaving herself unable to contradict any of his assertions. It is imperative to ascertain the rationale behind His Highness's decision to refrain from attributing the incident as an accident. Such an action would have constituted a courteous gesture, particularly given the individual's consistent display of politeness and respect. Over the course of nearly 2 days, he succeeded in persuading her to alter her opinion of him with each encounter. Initially, he exhibited a gentle demeanor, subsequently, he adopted a stern posture. Presently, his conduct is perplexing. The inquiry focuses on ascertaining the authenticity of the individual in question and the motivations behind his propensity to exhibit a variety of facades. Finally, the rationale behind the persistent presence of his face and touch in her mind, thereby dominating her thoughts, must be examined. Despite the passage of several hours, she remained in a crouched position on the floor. While she expressed gratitude that he had refrained from pursuing her, she found herself contemplating how she would navigate the situation in the days and weeks to come. Knock. Knock. Her heartbeat accelerated in response to the auditory stimulus, but she was able to regain composure upon hearing the voice of a domestic servant. "Miss Elara. May I enter?" The respectful maid made an inquiry and then awaited the response with composure. She rose from the floor without offering a response. Upon entering, she proceeded to secure the door. It has only recently become apparent that her actions were discourteous, as she had not been granted permission to enter the residence. In an attempt to compose herself, she inhaled deeply, attempting to calm her agitated mind. Thereafter, she proceeded with caution, gradually turning the lock, striving to maintain total silence throughout the process. It is evident that her actions were imprudent, as the maid, being a werewolf, was likely to have overheard the door unlocking. However, she appeared to be in a state of mental confusion. Subsequently, she proceeded from the doorway and proceeded in the direction of the restroom, her actions and thoughts marked by a certain naivete. "Please come in." She acquiesced to the increased volume, as if she had just emerged from the bathroom and was experiencing a sense of self-consciousness regarding her recent actions. "Miss Elara, I have procured dinner for you," the domestic servant replied as she entered, accompanied by another domestic servant who was bearing a tray containing sustenance. Expressions of gratitude are extended. She expressed gratitude, yet remained ill at ease, unable to meet the gaze of the 2 young women. She was contemplating the potential scenario of encountering him during dinner, but she perceived that the food supply was sufficient for only one individual. If she were to dine in solitude, it would be a most agreeable occurrence. "You are welcome." His Highness was obliged to take his leave for the day, and so he instructed us to deliver the dinner to your room. Regrettably, he will be unable to dine with you this evening." The domestic worker elaborated, although she did not inquire. The subject's evaluation of the situation was that it was all right. She asserted that her actions were motivated by the belief that it was the appropriate course of action. However, she was genuinely curious about the rationale behind the maid's decision to provide additional elaboration. This was not a necessary action. Despite having consumed a few bites of her dinner and preparing to sleep, she was still perturbed. Her cognitive processes exhibited a state of flux, characterized by a rapid succession of thoughts, which was abruptly interrupted. "Elara!" Two voices emerged, their utterances marked by a palpable enthusiasm, which abruptly roused her from her contemplations. "Sable! Naira!" Her response was immediate and characterized by a sense of profound elation. The affirmation "Yup! It's us!" was subsequently made. Naira's affirmation was characterized by a playful intonation, accompanied by physical movement that involved jumping up and down. The inquiry posed sought to ascertain the well-being of the individual in question. Sable inquired, her tone conveying concern. She was the more composed of the two individuals and had just taken a seat. "Affirmative. I am." The level of concern experienced was significant. "Your failure to respond to my inquiry is both perplexing and disconcerting," she promptly stated. "I apologize for the protracted healing process. Rest was necessary to facilitate recovery." Sable offered a reply expressing regret. They indicated that they had not been disconnected from the human side for such a protracted period. The response was affirmative. Naira concurred. "It is unlikely that she will accept our account of the events if she observes you behaving in such an animated manner." Sable informed the enthusiastic wolf of this fact, laughing in the process. "However, I require the physical activity. It has been a considerable amount of time since I was out, and even longer since I shifted." Naira exhibited signs of restlessness, moving about incessantly. While the necessity for change is acknowledged, the notion of incorporating exercise into this transition remains somewhat perplexing. "At this time, we do not have a body available. Therefore, it is necessary to determine the purpose of this exercise." Sable reasoned calmly. If Elara possessed a countenance devoid of emotion, Sable's expressionlessness was even more pronounced. However, this did not cause any distress to Elara or Naira. This was her innate manner of being. Despite her somewhat aloof demeanor, her intentions towards the other two were rooted in well-being. Naira exhibited a pout, but her demeanor did not indicate significant distress. Upon observing the aforementioned subjects, Elara experienced a sense of relief, accompanied by a slight expression of amusement. They spent the night in this manner, with Elara communicating with her wolves. However, this state of relaxation did not persist into the subsequent day. In the morning, as she was preparing herself for breakfast, she became aware of an increase in her heart rate. During the previous evening, she exhibited a greater sense of ease. However, at present, she found herself in a state of solitude once more. The wolves, as a pack, required additional rest, and their sudden arousal from slumber was indicative of a shift in her mood. Knock! Knock! The sudden auditory stimulus, characterized by persistent knocking at the door, induced a spontaneous physical reaction in her, causing her to abruptly rise from the sofa on which she was seated. The auditory sensation appeared to be generated by an object colliding with her heart, rather than by the door. "Please come in." She articulated the phrase with a higher pitch than intended, an unintentional vocal inflection that occurred while she was attempting to refrain from conveying her state of preoccupation through her verbal expression. "Miss Elara, we have prepared breakfast for you." The domestic worker, maintaining her cheerful disposition, informed her of the situation as she entered and opened the door, thereby creating an opportunity for the other domestic worker to enter with a tray. She exhaled with a sense of relief. She had anticipated the necessity of another encounter with the king in the near future, however, it appeared that he was also evading her. A sense of disquiet enveloped her as she reflected on the final aspect of the matter. The subject's disappointment regarding the subject's avoidance of her in the face of her expressed desire for proximity is a subject of inquiry. Expressions of gratitude are extended. She articulated her sentiments, hoping to conceal her emotional state. The present moment was not conducive to such contemplations. It is imperative that she abstain from contemplating this matter. She has convinced herself of this fact. "You are welcome." His Highness departed in the early hours of the morning, opting not to disturb you. He instructed us to deliver your breakfast upon your awakening. It should be noted, however, that there is no cause for concern. The individual in question will be dining at the palace that evening. The domestic servant conveyed the information in a cheerful manner. She signaled her consent with a subtle gesture, refraining from verbal confirmation. Despite her inability to comprehend the rationale behind the maid's repeated communication of the king's whereabouts, she recognized the improbability of soliciting direct clarification from the maid on the matter. Consequently, she elected to disregard the issue, opting instead to focus on savoring her meal, at least for the time being. She successfully completed her breakfast obligations, and it appeared that her lunch would also proceed without incident. However, concerns regarding her dinner plans remained. The following is a list of key elements that must be included in any discussion of this subject. While in transit, Theron was engaged in several activities. These activities included typing on a laptop and reviewing documents. Concurrently, Theron was also listening to reports from Oren. "Your Highness, the Council has initiated further actions. It has been communicated to me that Martha Johnson arrived at the airport yesterday." Oren articulated his perspective with his customary intonation, among other elements of his discourse. "So?" Theron's inquiry was devoid of any discernible interest in the subject matter. It is worth noting that Martha Johnson was, if memory serves, one of the granddaughters of the third councilman, Merrick Johnson. It can be posited that the subject's desire to visit her grandfather was a contributing factor in her actions. The necessity of his awareness remains a subject of inquiry. It has been determined that the subject in question did not make a visit to her grandfather. Oren elaborated further, as if intuitively grasping the subject matter. "I was informed that she came at the command of the head councilman. The subject is not currently involved in a romantic relationship, as her partner passed away shortly after their initial encounter several years ago. Notably, she has been identified as a top contender by the council for the role of your partner." Oren proceeded to elaborate on the subject, as Theron appeared to have difficulty comprehending the explanation provided. This perspective is indicative of the subject's self-perception. The air within the vehicle abruptly grew cold as Theron comprehended his implication. The collective atmosphere surrounding Theron proved challenging for Oren and the driver, despite their awareness that his ire was not directed towards them. The Council is hereby instructed to commence preparations for the submission of 2 reports. The first report should detail the results of the investigations into all Moonlight-related problems that have occurred this year. The second report should be a preliminary one, outlining the Council's budget and expenses for the next 3 years. The deadline for submission is December 31st of this year. Theron issued an order, her expression devoid of emotion, after what felt like an eternity. If those individuals had ample time, he would ensure that their days were occupied with a substantial workload. This course of action would allow him to exact retribution. The response to the inquiry was affirmative, and the action was confirmed. Oren confirmed this assessment. His Highness's approach was characterized by its unrelenting severity. The reports he had requested were expected to require a period of 1 to 2 months for their compilation, under the condition that the team maintained uninterrupted focus throughout the process. Typically, the Council would submit its reports to His Highness by February of the subsequent year. However, he was currently utilizing all of the available time, including the winter recess. In addition, the palace guards must be informed that no one is permitted to enter the palace today without explicit authorization. Theron issued a concise directive, then resumed the examination of the documents. Elara was in the palace alone, and he was not inclined to introduce her to the old man. It is also important to consider the possibility that he might suddenly conceive of a number of innovative ideas. Furthermore, Varek possessed the ability to escort the woman directly to the palace, thereby presenting the opportunity for the king to observe her without prior notification. He was convinced of this, having experienced similar situations in the past. In the event that Elara encountered the aforementioned woman, it is conceivable that she might have perceived him as a man of casual and relaxed disposition. He is a man who engages in brief romantic encounters without significant commitment. The most unfavorable outcome would be the formation of a negative impression of him by her. The visual representation of her displeasure caused him discomfort. However, contemplating the captivating woman who had captured his lips prompted a subtle expression of contentment, manifesting as a barely perceptible smile. He had not anticipated such audacity on her part, given the circumstances, and was taken aback by the intensity of her embrace. Therefore, during her period of vulnerability, she conceptualized him as a source of support. Was that not the case? Consequently, it can be inferred that her actions and expressions of affection towards him were indicative of her fondness for him. Notwithstanding, she did engage in a kiss with him, voluntarily and without coercion. The subject continued to experience vivid dreams, characterized by a state of heightened awareness. This led to a sense of uncertainty regarding the most optimal subsequent course of action. The subsequent discussion will explore strategies for leveraging this opportunity to effect positive change. After a period of internal deliberation, he reluctantly concluded that he had no alternative but to proceed with the man. Regrettably, he had no other individual to whom he could solicit counsel on the appropriate course of action. The man had a tendency to boast about his relationship to everyone. It was reasonable to assume that he had done something correctly to obtain his partner. "Elias, are you currently at home?" Theron inquired as the telephone call was being answered on the opposite end. Had Elara been privy to Theron's genuine sentiments, the idealized image she had crafted regarding the foremost-ranked werewolf, the preeminent werewolf in the kingdom, would have been utterly dispelled. Her perception of him as a strict and solemn individual would be utterly dispelled. The hours that followed were swift for Elara, and despite her awareness that His Highness was not in the palace, she did not venture beyond the guest room. However, she exhibited no signs of relaxation. As the designated hour for the evening meal approached, she had yet to devise a strategy to address the king. She paced back and forth with increasing frequency, her anticipation mounting with each passing moment as she awaited the imminent knock that would announce the arrival of dinner. She considered declining, hypothesizing that she could feign an absence of appetite to the maid, yet she was uncertain how to proceed should the king elect to inspect her condition. It is imperative to ascertain the rationale behind her decision to abstain from dining. She was still pacing in the room when a sound prompted her to turn towards the door. Knock. Knock. The following is a list of key elements that must be included in any discussion of this subject. Upon concluding his telephone conversation, Elias was preoccupied with profound contemplation when his companion entered the room. What is the rationale behind your laser-like concentration? Are you still grappling with identifying the culprits? Vera inquired, her tone conveying concern. That issue is a source of concern as well. However, we have a more pressing matter to address. He asserted this position with notable conviction. The inquiry posed pertains to the nature of the issue in question. Her inquiry was characterized by an escalating degree of concern. The inclusion of her in this context raises questions regarding the significance attributed to her presence. His Highness made an inquiry. He is coming to our house. Elias provided a concise response. His Highness. The rationale behind this choice remains unclear. He invariably invites you to the palace. He had never previously visited our residence. Vera's reaction was one of surprise. We are on the verge of ascertaining the truth. He is expected to arrive within approximately 1 hour. In response, he exhibited a thoughtful expression. What? This occurrence is imminent. It is imperative that I prepare accordingly. The availability of sufficient food for lunch and its potential compatibility with his preferences remain uncertain. What if he opts to dine with us? The subject indicated that she was frightened and proceeded immediately, without awaiting a response from Elias, to exit the room. The following is a list of key elements that must be included in any discussion of this subject. Vera experienced significant respiratory distress in the presence of the alpha aura emanating from His Highness. The female subject was seated alongside her companion on a single couch, exhibiting a deliberate effort to maintain an upright posture, her gaze fixed intently on the opposing couch, on which Theron was seated. His posture, characterized by one foot crossed over the other, and his countenance, devoid of expression, further accentuated the enigmatic nature of his stance. Despite not yet being informed of the rationale behind Theron's visit, the tension evident in his facial expression and the evident relief he was experiencing led her to conclude that the matter was of paramount importance. Following a series of subsequent moments characterized by a palpable sense of suspense, Theron directed his attention toward his beta and articulated a series of words that were acknowledged by the latter before the subjects disengaged from each other. Shortly after Oren's departure, Theron initiated a discussion regarding the purpose of his visit. The following assertion is to be regarded as strictly confidential and not to be disseminated beyond the confines of this room. Disobey this directive, and you will face the consequences. The sixth-ranked wolf was visibly frightened, despite the calmness in the wolf's voice. Elias had assured Vera that the experience would not be frightening, but she now had reason to believe that his assessment was inaccurate. The future of the kingdom is contingent upon the counsel provided, therefore, it is imperative to deliberate thoroughly prior to articulation. Theron proceeded in a solemn manner. Vera was already experiencing tremors. She had never anticipated that the fate of the entire werewolf race would be contingent on her mate and herself. She was the partner of Elias, who occupied a position of significant importance. Maintaining her breath-holding posture, she awaited the utterance of the king. The following query has been posed: what course of action must be taken following an instance of physical contact between lips and the lips of a woman who subsequently departs from the scene? He inquired calmly, his gaze fixed intently on the others, awaiting their response. He remained unwilling to categorize the act of touching their lips as anything other than a kiss. Both parties were taken aback by the unexpected turn of events. Vera's astonishment stemmed from her unanticipated discovery of the underlying cause of the werewolf race's potential decline. Elias's reaction to the rapid transformation from the previous day's state to the present one can be attributed to his lack of anticipation for such a significant change. Elara's presence in Theron's life had introduced an element of unpredictability to his future, albeit in a positive sense. It had been hypothesized that Theron would not react as swiftly as he did. Yesterday, he was still deliberating on whether to act, but what transpired since then? The motivation behind Elara's decision to engage in a kiss with Theron remains a subject of inquiry. It is reasonable to hypothesize that Theron's actions or influence enabled this bold initiative, as it seems implausible that she would have taken such a significant step independently. Her reserved and grave demeanor seemingly precluded the capacity to undertake such an endeavor. Theron, in particular, would never permit anyone to approach him so closely, much less engage in a kiss, without his explicit consent. If only he had remained at the palace for a more extended period the previous day, he reflected. It is unfortunate that the opportunity to engage in such a meaningful exchange was not realized. Your Highness, what precisely transpired? Elias probed, perhaps in an attempt to ascertain additional details. That is not a matter of relevance to you. The imperative is to respond to the query directly. Theron's response was composed and measured. It is imperative that you disclose the purpose of your visit. The decision to pursue a romantic relationship with her or to maintain a distance is a critical one. He inquired, relinquishing his pursuit of further information, yet his curiosity remained piqued by this matter. Theron paused for a moment, recognizing the need to exercise discretion and refrain from divulging excessive information. However, he acknowledged the imperative to articulate the following sentiment. Pursue her. In a concise response, he articulated his perspective. Vera was taken aback by the revelation. It was unprecedented for His Highness to discuss a woman, much less engage in a romantic relationship. She found herself unable to conceptualize the type of woman responsible for shaping Theron's character. Could it be that he had found his mate? She speculated. Elias experienced a profound sense of elation at the request by His Highness for his perspective on the matter. He cleared his voice and adopted a scholarly tone reminiscent of his time at the Royal Academy. He exhibited signs of a cough, which resulted in a slight clearing of his throat. After a brief period of reflection, he proceeded to articulate his thoughts. Your Highness, it is imperative that you understand that the most crucial aspect of this matter is to maintain your integrity and fortitude. Elias articulated the situation with a countenance marked by gravity. Theron's countenance darkened, as he pondered the notion that a propensity for shamelessness could conceivably be of any benefit. Elias, it is imperative that you abstain from imparting insubstantial knowledge to His Highness. Of paramount importance is for the individual in question to comport himself in a manner befitting a gentleman and to demonstrate a sense of responsibility towards the aforementioned female. In time, it will surely win her heart. Vera's response was an immediate rejection of the notion. Have I succeeded in winning your affection by exhibiting chivalrous behavior? Despite the realization that we were gently compatible, you declined to pursue a romantic relationship with me. Consequently, the inquiry was posed, by what means have I succeeded in capturing your affection? He inquired with his eyes narrowed, his gaze fixed on her. Vera experienced a facial reddening, commonly referred to as a blush, and found herself at a loss for words, unable to articulate the manner in which he had accomplished this feat. However, she was certain that he did not possess the demeanor and comportment of a gentleman. The actions he undertook. Upon observing her avert her gaze, her countenance exhibiting a reddish hue, he experienced a sense of satisfaction. The veracity of the assertion was indisputably evidenced by the evident manifestation in Theron's countenance. So, Your Highness. As is evident. He articulated with a gesture toward his companion, provoking a sharp glance from Vera, and then resumed his statement after a brief cough. It is hypothesized that the aforementioned point has been sufficiently explained. Elias maintained a sense of self-satisfaction. Theron's countenance evinced profound contemplation. If he were to consider it, his behavior last night could also be characterized as somewhat shameless. He experienced intense jealousy when he witnessed Elara being embraced by another individual. This emotion was so profound that, following the calming of dusk after a period of agitation, he actively sought her out once more. In the indoor garden, she appeared weak and distressed, and she embraced him passively before succumbing to sleep. From a logical perspective, it would have been reasonable for him to escort her to her room so that she could sleep in a comfortable manner. However, he did not do so. To a certain extent, he exploited the circumstances. He embraced her, relishing the proximity of her body, and even ventured to kiss her temple when her face was in such close proximity to his. This gesture was sufficient to rouse her from her slumber, and she inadvertently planted a kiss on his lips. He conceded that he had indeed touched his lips. Instead of exhibiting chivalry and assuaging her concerns, he insisted on a kiss. Furthermore, he had previously demonstrated a lack of reluctance to engage in physical contact with her lips. He derived pleasure from her flustered demeanor, which manifested due to his presence, as it appeared to her that in that particular moment, she regarded him as a man rather than a king. The man's cognitive processes were still underway when Elias's interruption commenced. Pay close attention to the following instruction, as it will enable you to successfully court the desired female companion. He reiterated this assertion with a serious expression. Elias cleared his voice and began to explain. He was on the verge of imparting to Theron the art of living a life of shamelessness. Typically, Theron would rebuff Elias if he perceived him to be intellectually deficient. However, on this occasion, Theron discerned a modicum of wisdom in Elias's remarks and elected to refrain from comment, instead opting to heed his counsel. Even Dusk demonstrated a heightened state of awareness, attuned to the ambient sounds that surrounded them. Vera had relinquished her attempts to persuade them otherwise. She remained seated on the sofa, her attention focused on the act of self-massage on her temples. Notwithstanding, she intermittently engaged when the counsel became overly embellished. Elara proceeded with measured strides, leading to her arrival at the dining room's entrance. Upon opening the door, the domestic worker turned toward her and, with a smile, gestured with her hand for her to enter. She entered the room without even breathing or looking around. Contrary to her expectations, the maid did not enter with her, exacerbating her feelings of anxiety. The inquiry post sought to ascertain the duration of the individual's anticipated presence near the doorway. The voice that caused her heart to race inquired, as she remained hesitant to approach the table and take a seat, even after a considerable amount of time had elapsed. Upon hearing the distinctive low male voice, she felt an urge to act on her instincts. She turned toward the door, intending to open it and flee to her room. However, on this occasion, she merely succeeded in placing her hand on the doorknob when another hand obstructed her attempt to rotate it. "To which destination are you headed?" "The table is positioned in the opposite direction," he articulated with a soothing voice, delicately tracing the edge of her ear as his countenance neared. In essence, he was killing her. It was evident that he persistently engaged in physical contact with her, and this contact appeared to be more overt in nature than previously observed. He withdrew his hand, yet maintained a proximity to her. It was evident that he was awaiting her to take a seat. Confronted with this ultimatum and driven by a desire to avoid further disrespect, she proceeded to take a seat on the chair. Subsequent to this action, Theron proceeded to his seat. He had not yet commenced ingestion of foodstuffs, as he had been awaiting her arrival. In a manner consistent with their previous shared dining experience, he selected a variety of foods and placed them on her plate, subsequently selecting a selection of dishes for himself. The subjects consumed their meal in silence, and initially, the female subject exhibited minimal engagement with the culinary offerings, nibbling only a few items. The experience was challenging, as she felt a sensation of constriction in her throat. However, she acknowledged that this was preferable to abstaining from eating. Despite the absence of gustatory sensation, she continued to consume food, driven by the need to maintain her nutritional intake. Subsequent to the repast, she expressed a desire to withdraw to her private quarters. She was on the verge of addressing this issue, but he preempted her and initiated the conversation. The proposal was made to engage in the consumption of tea. He then proceeded to position the cup directly in front of her. She believed that she could still retire early, she simply had to consume the tea rapidly and depart. Therefore, it is time to address the matter of the kiss. He began to articulate his thoughts just as she was on the verge of taking the initial sip, but he ceased speaking when Elara began to cough uncontrollably, having momentarily choked on the tea. Consume this beverage at a gradual pace, as its temperature remains elevated. Why are you so clumsy? He exhaled as he grasped a napkin and extended it to her. She then took the napkin and wiped her mouth. The question of culpability in this matter remains ambiguous, as it is unclear who was responsible for the incident that resulted in the woman experiencing a choking episode. The inquiry post sought to ascertain the well-being of the individual in question. Theron inquired, her brow furrowed with concern. She merely nodded in response, as she was reluctant to articulate her thoughts. She was apprehensive that she might stutter if she verbalized even a single word. Additionally, she refrained from raising her eyes to look up. The previous evening, he had captured her gaze, and she was apprehensive about the possibility of a recurrence. He vocalized a slight exhalation, exceeding his typical volume. Join our Facebook and WhatsApp group for more updates. Link is given in description. Rest audiobook will be continued in next episode.